What's up guys and welcome back to Mona Inc. If you guys are new here, then what is up? My name is Erica. Hey, how you doing? Now today we're just gonna roll straight into the video because I had the absolute pleasure this morning of speaking to Tim Whitmarsh, who is author of my new favorite nonfiction book, which is Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World. Now this is not the only book that Professor Whitmarsh has written, I just want to highlight that now. However, it is the one that our conversation will be centered around. If you want to know more so, bar the title, what the book is about, and exactly what I thought of the book, I have reviewed the book already on the channel, so you guys can watch that video. It'll be linked in the description below, but also popping up wherever that thing does. Now, Tim Whitmarsh is a classics professor at the University of Cambridge, and so I really took this chance to completely rack his brain and get into every little bit and crevice in regards to this topic of conversation. In the following interview, you guys will see an explanation of religion in the ancient Greek and Roman world from the pre-Socratics all the way through to the Roman Empire. There's a lot of ground that is covered, and honestly, I can't thank Tim Whitmarsh enough for sitting down and for actually helping me sort of unpack this massive, massive topic and philosophical thought. And so therefore I'm so happy to roll to this interview for you guys. So let's just get to it. Tim, thank you so much for joining me today on the channel.
It's a great pleasure. Great to meet you, Erica.
I'm so excited for this because this is really just like a proper nerdy moment for me, because I wrote my thesis at university not exactly on the topic of atheism, because I wasn't really with a professor that was like, oh, atheism is a really encouraging topic, we should do that. He was more so, why don't we just question it a little bit? So the whole paper was me being like, I wonder what this means. So reading this was fantastic and really eye-opening for me. But I really wanted to start this conversation by getting into you and seeing where your classics journey began and how you got into being the professor that you are today.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a long journey, as you would understand. I mean, what I would say is that I grew up in the countryside in the Herefordshire sort of area, and there wasn't that much to do as a teenager in the countryside. So I used to just, go wandering around the local castle and things like that. So I just got very familiar with the idea of ancient ruins being part of the local landscape, and learned to love them in a way and to sort of touch them, stroke them, and get sort of imaginatively fired up by them. And then first time I went on an aeroplane actually was when I went to Greece when I was about 18 on a school trip, and just kind of had the same sort of reaction there, but scaled up, if you see what I mean, because they're older and they're more ruiny, but they're also more evocative and imaginative. So for me, it was very much about the built environment, if you like, so the experience with the stones and all that, and just that sense of grandeur and majesty that you get from being in these environments.
Did you have the chance at school to study classics as well, or was it really just an independent study?
I did, yeah. So I'm old enough that I was of that era when, there's quite a lot of classics were still taught in schools. I mean, that's going up and down, actually. I have to say, we should be pretty optimistic about schools at the moment. There's a lot of dedicated teachers out there who are, and people like yourself as well, kind of encouraging young people into the world of classics. So, I'm not a doom and gloom person. I do think that the future can be, if we continue to put the effort into it, can be very lively in schools.
I agree, and I think like with social media as well, that's really helping, and the resurgence of people wanting to buy books as well. Like it seems now, I think probably with social media and people chatting online, people are so encouraged to go and read books now and engage with that stuff, which I think is really promising, like you said. Yep,
and you can get a book in the click of a button on your Kindle or whatever. There's so many ways of reading, and Audible as well, audiobooks. I mean, it's just the world is very, very rich for ways of accessing information now, not just in terms of Wikipedia and the like.
But then did you go to university and study classics and then continue to become a doctor now, as you are a doctor professor? And
yes, it was pretty linear. Yeah, although I had a couple of gap years out, I did a bit of school teaching and did various other things. I was a spot welder for a while in a local factory and the like. But no, I mean, I was very fortunate. I mean, again, it's a different world now. I think people have very much more by way of options in front of them when they go to university, and people are encouraged to think about careers in front. I mean, I mean, several things. One was my view of the world was very small and narrow, I think. And the other was that I was kind of quite good at, doing the tasks that were in front of me. So in a sense, you do that task and then the door opens up and then you go. But I also did just continue to love it. And although I didn't end up working on, the stones and the buildings and that sort of thing, I ended up more working in the text and the ideas and the stories and the like. I've always had that sense that, Greece is my happy place, both modern Greece, which I visit, 2 or 3 times a year, most years, and the ancient Greek world that you access through the books and the text.
And was atheism always a draw for you, or how did you start? Because you have other books under your belt, but today we're really going to be talking about Battling the Gods, which I have sitting right next to me. So I don't want to discredit your other books, but was atheism always in there, or was that something that came out through writing the other books or through your academic journey?
Well, so I have always been interested in atheism and in religion. I am a self-identified atheist, but I'm not one of these sort of punch you in the face sort of atheist. I'm quite humble in terms of I don't really know what's going on out there. Whatever. It's just that intuitively I don't feel connected to the idea of a God. But now I was brought up Catholic, so I clearly have quite a strong sense of at least the Catholic version of what the Bible is doing and the like. So out of that mismatch, if you like, between where my mind works, the way my mind works and the way I was brought up, I think a lot of the seeds of this book were sown. But it's also, this is a different kind of book to my other books, which are pretty academic. The other books, they've sold, at most, I think my best-selling book is sort of pushing 1,000 copies or whatever, my non-academic book, but most of them sell in the low hundreds or whatever, because they are very niche and they're bought primarily by libraries and they're used by scholars and students rather than attempts to communicate with the wider world. I've done quite a lot of attempts to communicate with the wider world through TV and radio and newspaper articles and that sort of thing. But this is the only book that I've written along these lines. And to write a book like this, you do need something that is not just niche academic stuff, something that really does talk to a wider public. And that was my attempt with this book. I think it still remains, as I think you've said in the past, it doesn't have quite the same, how can I put this, sort of accessibility as some popular books. It remains quite it's a book about ideas and the journey that you have to go on through that involves engaging with the ideas at some point. I try to make it as accessible as possible, but it is really, a book about just immersing you in the thought world of the ancients, which is not a sort of super easy route. But yeah, anyway, so the idea for Battling the Gods really came from discussions with publishers, and I'd send them ideas and I'd say things like, what about a biography of a sort of somebody in the 2nd century AD? They'd say, no, it's a terrible idea. It sounds awful. Just throw ideas at them, and then they come back sort of saying they were awful. And then this one landed. And of course, it was conceived and published at the time when I think Christopher Hitchens was still alive. Richard Dawkins was certainly still in his pomp, appearing on our tellies, telling us how religion was evil and, needs to be overthrown and all that sort of stuff. So it just seemed to be a good time to tell the story, the longer story, if you like, of atheism.
And when you were writing this book, because you kind of briefly said that you were thinking about how to engage with everybody, were you really focused on a certain audience, or was it also partly a passion project for yourself, or like who is this book for primarily?
It wasn't a passion project for myself. No, I was very conscious of the need to communicate with a wider audience. It's a difficult one because, my bread and butter job is as an academic, and in a sense, I had to kind of marry the two together at some level, because if you're an academic, if you publish something that doesn't have proper documentation or doesn't, just simplifies things or whatever, people jump on it and say that, that guy's an idiot, it has career implications. So I didn't want to go down that route. Not that people that write popular books, do that, but that was the risk that I felt at the time. At the same time, I wanted to write books that my parents could read, and still my favorite Amazon review of Battling the Gods is by one of my son's friends, who gives it 5 stars and says, my friend's dad wrote this. So, there were kind of school kids reading it as well. And again, I suspect they had to put in more effort reading it than they did for reading Game of Thrones or something. But, people did find it, school kids did find it accessible and, with a bit of effort, a helpful book to read. So yeah, I mean, I did have that sense of, people that I knew that weren't academics, family members primarily, they were my target readership.
So with talking about this book specifically, I think I was trying to figure out how to do this properly, because I wanted to make sure that everybody could come on the journey of your book with us, and not feel like they were just thrown in the deep end. So I thought possibly the best way to open this would be discussing the ancient Greek gods, and primarily I think answering the questions, because people are most familiar with those gods in myth. They're familiar with Zeus running around and being different animals to take women, shall we say, and his wife chasing all of the children of his affairs. So would the ancients have worshipped those gods as part of their religion, or did they have a separate sort of idea of what the gods were, and those were liberties taken in storytelling? How did that work with the ancient world?
This $1 million question. I mean, I think underlying that question is a sense of the enormous difference between ancient religions with their many gods and modern, primarily, if we think about the major religions of the West, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, they're all united by the fact that, they have an attempt to be a sort of coherent belief system, which is based on scripture, which, that the idea at least is that gives you a firm sense of how to access the divine and what one should do and the proper moral codes and the like. Ancient Greek religion was nothing like that whatsoever. For a start, they didn't have the equivalent of the Bible. They didn't have any source text that could actually structure their relationship to the gods. But of course, for much of antiquity, Greece was not even a united country. So every single city had its own different way of accessing the gods, and they had their own kind of local deities that they would elevate above the other ones. So, I mean, take the obvious example, Athena in Athens. I mean, even the city is named after her. The temple of Athena, Parthenos, what we call the Parthenon on the Acropolis, is a very, very, very distinctive manifestation of the goddess Athena. Would the Athenians have joined that Athena up with the Athena of Homer? In a sense, yes. Would they have thought that when they were doing whatever they did, because we don't know that they even worshipped the Parthenon, actually, we don't even have an altar outside, so we don't know whether they sacrificed it or whatever, but when they went to the Acropolis and marveled at the majesty of the Parthenon, did they have in their mind a sort of Homeric image of Athena? Some would have done, some wouldn't have done. It's a very different approach to religion, which is much more based around the interaction between individuals and communities on the one hand, and the act of sacrifice outside or in the vicinity of a temple. It's that sense of the community coming together to celebrate itself as a community around the act of ritual. That's what holds it together. And nobody ever at any point in antiquity, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but basically nobody came along and said, okay, well, let's take an overview of Greek religion, put it all together, make it coherent, try and answer all those questions that I was just asking about whether the gods of myth are the same as the gods of daily worship or whatever. They just enjoyed the complexity and the capacity of this system. I think that's the other thing, is that it's, life is complicated. Spoiler alert. Politics are complicated. Greek religion was the very fact that it didn't have an order and a structure and a system that made it such an effective way of holding together Greece as a politically non-unified state for all that time. I mean, they could not state, but entity for all that time.
Yeah, it's something that you said just then, which was one of the main things that I highlighted in the book that I had just never seen written down. I know that sounds really weird, but it's sort of implied, but I just never seen it written down, was how there was no explicit religious text, sort of like in the way that we have, the Bible and the Torah and all those things. They didn't have the equivalent of that. And one question that I had running through the book, which I think probably a lot of people after hearing that would also have, that what do you think were the implications then on how people then were allowed to interpret the gods, which people, of modern religions might not understand that there was there more wiggle room in that front? Could they have done more with the gods in ancient times because of that?
I think so, yes. I mean, you do find people, of course, saying that's blasphemous, that's a terrible thing to say about the gods. But then you do find people saying, I mean, the book is essentially about people saying, I don't believe in that, either that version of what the god is, or that god at all, which is the extreme end of the reaction to that. So it is a very flexible system in terms of forms of belief as well. And the book, there are a lot of philosophers in the book, and philosopher sounds a very scary word. If you met somebody in your school or, on the bus or whatever, who said, hello, I'm a philosopher, I'd like to meet you and talk to you, but, you probably think, help, I'm going to be interrogated by this very scary individual. In the Greek world, it didn't quite have that sense, because it was much less formalized. There was no profession of being a philosopher or anything. These were just people who had ideas, who were generating ideas and trying to, in a sense, make sense of the world that they lived in. So these philosophers would, they had very many different ways of answering the kinds of questions that you're raising now. How do you make sense of the gods of myth, who are essentially, by most standards, immoral? They do really, really bad things. And this was a problem that the Greeks never really resolved throughout their entire history, 1,000 years of antiquity or so, recorded antiquity. So I mentioned earlier that there's no Bible or Quran for the Greeks. They do have, the closest they have, of course, is the poetry of Homer, and the myths of the Trojan War and the Odyssey, which they loved, and were sort of culturally central in a way that is sort of comparable to the Bible in Europe, or Islam in certain parts of Europe. So in a way, they have this sort of culturally central text, but they don't have the same protectiveness around it. There is so much room for reinterpretation or rejection of these gods. And in a way, the texts demand that you do that, because you can't have, any sort of moral system which says that the top god goes around, as you say, doing terrible things to women when they're, in the form of animals or whatever. So it's sort of built into the system that you have to question Homer.
And that is sort of where the philosophical journey, at least for me, I'm not the expert, sort of begins, right? So I brought a book to show everybody that I have this book. If you guys want to read the Pre-Socratics, this is sort of where I would suggest that you start, unless you have a better recommendation. But as somebody who was not very good at Greek at uni, this ended up being my Bible, which went into all the fragments of people before Plato and had the Greek next to it, the English. So would recommend, if this conversation spurs you on, that you should definitely start with that book. But that is kind of where they start. The Pre-Socratics start by getting into Homer, really, and they really start attacking the Homeric gods. We have a couple that do it explicitly, like Xenophanes, for example, literally attacks them by name, attacks Homer by name, and goes through all of them. So my main question with them is, who do you think of all of them, would you say is probably the easiest for people to understand from a modern perspective, that reading somebody like a Pre-Socratic is very difficult, but if they wanted to tackle those and go into that before we go into Plato, who would be the easiest for them to get around to?
Well, I do think that you mentioned Xenophanes. I think he's probably the most useful figure to begin with. He's a really interesting guy. You mentioned that he says several things about the Homeric gods. One point that he makes is that Homer and Hesiod are, in a sense, full of fictions, as he called it. The earliest use of the word fiction, or at least the Greek word that translates fiction, which is really interesting, because that's really, it's not just a philosophical point, it's a point about literature really as well. It's about saying that, you can read the stuff, but it's made up. So he particularly cites centaurs and mythical beasts as examples of fictions in Homer. The next fragment to talk about is the one that you were alluding to, where he says that Homer and Hesiod's conceptions of the gods must be wrong because they represent them as committing immoral acts, adultery, stealing, cheating, and the like. But there's one other really important fragment in that connection, which is where he says the Greeks have the wrong idea of the gods. I'm paraphrasing here, because what you would find, actually the two related fragments here, what you would find is that if you go to other cultures, they conceive of the gods in their own likeness. So if you go to Thrace in the north, he says you would, their gods have blue eyes and I forget, is it red hair or something. So what he's saying there is that there cannot be, if every culture projects its own image onto the gods, they cannot all be right simultaneously. So therefore, the idea of a god that is like a human must be wrong. And then he takes it one step further, and he says the same goes for animals as well. If horses and cows had ways of representing the gods, then they would represent the gods as horses and cows. So in a sense, it's basically doing two things, I think. One is saying that any sort of human-centered or species-centered projection of the divine is going to be wrong because it's limited by the perspective of that individual. The other thing that he's saying, I think, which is really important, which is more subtle here, which is that because he's writing later on, as he sees it from Homer and Hesiod, he's essentially saying, I've got more worldly experience than these guys. Things move on over time. Homer and Hesiod had a very narrow Greek-centered view of the world. I've actually gone out and met people in different parts of the world. We're in a more fluid, interactive world now. And this greater sort of cultural competence, this greater understanding of the nature of the world has given me the perspective to see that an old-fashioned view of the gods must be rejected. And instead, what he proposes is a view of what he calls the one God. So he sees the cosmos basically as animated by a single, invisible, barely understandable deity. And that's his solution to the answer. So he's not an atheist. He does replace the many gods with a one God. But he, this is a God that just doesn't fit the Greek worldview at all, because it doesn't fit the gods of myth, nor, crucially, does it fit the gods of religion, of cult. You cannot sacrifice to the one God. There's no temple to the one God. It's a God of the mind. And that really is a revolutionary moment.
So I had a really selfish question, which I know I've already emailed to you because this is something that I was struggling with when I was writing my thesis. So for all of my audience, just bear with me when I get really nerdy here. But so that sentiment of this idea of a one God, and I felt even that I could have completely misread this. I felt that also kind of came out in Anaxagoras with his idea of the nous. So he has this idea of like this higher being power sort of thing. I don't want to say being, but this higher power. And for me, what I was wondering, I wanted to ask you, is that why do we need to read that as more of a nature explanation, if that makes sense, rather than seeing it as henotheistic deities or deism in a more modern, like deism is a much more modern word, but not in that sense. Why can't we read it that way, and we should read it more so as a nature power sort of thing?
So Anaxagoras is, if you like, in many ways, he's the spiritual successor. That's the wrong way of framing it. But he's the heir of Xenophanes' ideas. And like Xenophanes, he thinks that there is a single animating force in the universe. He doesn't, interestingly, call it a god. He calls it, as you say, the nous, the mind. What links together Xenophanes and Anaxagoras is that I think basically both of them are thinking about the ways in which the universe works according to regular cycles. That's what they're centrally interested in. Why does the sun rise in the same way every day? Why do we have seasons? Why do the stars follow the same patterns across the sky? They both are quite interested in unusual weather phenomena like rainbows, clouds, but they both think that these are explicable in terms of rationality, that you can actually say that the combination of elements or whatever, the collision of this and that or whatever, explains that kind of unusual weather phenomenon. So, as I say, they're trying to understand the nature of order. Now, this is a really fascinating but kind of quite difficult question. Is that a basically scientific way of looking at the world, or is that a basically religious way of looking at the world? You could flip it either way. You could say it's scientific because they're not interested in gods who can appear to you and talk to you and interact with you or whatever. They're interested solely in the mechanics of the universe, not solely, but primarily in the mechanics of the universe, which, as I say, looks scientific, and many people would read Xenophanes and Anaxagoras as scientific. But they're trying to explain it in terms of a single central being of some kind that doesn't fit, as I say, the normal boxes of Greek religion. But nevertheless, at least Xenophanes calls it a god. So, that might be a, what we sometimes call a god of the gaps argument, which is where, things that cannot be scientifically explained, everything that's not science has to be ultimately powered by God. I think ultimately this just shows the poverty of our own modern categories. I don't think we've quite got the language really to answer these questions. Is it scientific or is it religious? I don't know, but it's absolutely fascinating.
It completely played me, like when I was doing my thesis, I flip-flopped between discussing both of them because I was like, I have no idea, and I guess it could be henotheistic, it kind of seems that way, but then these are also kind of modernish words, so implying a modern idea onto the ancients, you also have to be really wary of that, and so I was constantly wary of that. But actually talking about that, our modern idea of atheism is different somewhat to the ancients, isn't it? So can you actually walk us through what the terms theos and atheos from the ancient Greek mean in the context that you go into in the book? Yeah,
sure. So theos is, as you say, the Greek word for God, which does that mean the same as a modern conception of God? I don't know. Let's not go there, but it's broadly the same kind of thing. And atheos means someone without a god, because the a bit at the beginning is a feature of the Greek language that if you put an a on the beginning of words, it negates it. It turns it into the opposite of it. So an atheos is someone without God or a god. Now, the first uses of that word imply people who are God-forsaken, and they're used in Greek tragedy, essentially. And in Greek tragedy, there are quite a lot of God-forsaken people who are just having a horrible time, and they're cursed by the gods, and they don't like the world, and they're sort of abandoned by society or whatever. That's basically the spoiler alert for Greek tragedy. I'm spoiling everything at the moment. At some point in the 5th century, which is really the pivotal era, this is the era of the major tragic poets, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides. It's the era when Plato is born. He writes in the 4th century, but Socrates is around. It's the era when the Parthenon is built and all that. Most of the stuff that we associate with the age of Athens or whatever, classical Athens, is 5th century stuff. Now, at some point, that word gains an additional meaning, which is someone who doesn't, it's slightly ambiguous whether it means doesn't believe in the gods or doesn't worship the gods, doesn't actually go through the practical processes of sacrificing and engaging in religion. And I think that sort of blurriness is part of the general blurriness of Greek religion generally. As I've said many times, one of the really interesting things about the Greeks is that they just don't sit very naturally in the modern categories that we have. So the distinction between sort of worship and belief, actual worship as in going to church and engaging in a sacrament or whatever on the one hand, and believing it in your head, that's not a distinction that they make in any sharp terms. So atheos, which is the origin of the modern word atheism, starts out in that era in the classical Athens, meaning somebody who doesn't play ball in terms of conventional religion. And it's a word that is used in a negative, aggressive way to target philosophers, particularly your friend Anaxagoras, the bloke who has this idea of the cosmic mind, the cosmic nous, which he doesn't call a god, because Anaxagoras seems to have denied the deity of these celestial bodies. So the sun and the moon, he said, are not gods, they're just lumps of a mineral. So that seems to have been the reason why he was accused of something like atheism, although the word isn't exactly used in connection with Anaxagoras. Here I am overqualifying things again, but but it is used seemingly in connection with Socrates. And Socrates is sort of rolled in with Anaxagoras as one of these newfangled thinkers who, have turned everything on their head and taught people to question things. And I mean, Socrates himself wasn't actually particularly interested in the nature of the universe. He was more interested in people's interaction with each other and right and wrong and ethics, as we call it. But he seems to have been rolled in with Anaxagoras as one of these people who didn't believe in the divine nature of the world around us.
I'm so glad that you looked at Socrates, because that's exactly what I wanted to do as soon as you mentioned him, because Socrates was put on trial for his impiety. And something that's always really fascinated me about this topic of religion in the ancient world was the shift from it being this sort of mental sparring, which I think you mentioned as well in the book, that there was another author, someone Lloyd, forgive me, I've forgotten what his name was. But
Jeffrey, yeah.
Yeah, so he spoke about how there was a lot of that sort of mental sparring going on and the competitiveness. So that's how it sort of starts, and then it becomes this legal thing where suddenly you can put people on trial. And I was really curious about that and opening my audience up to that. So what was that shift that happened between this idea that you can talk about things openly and then suddenly the 70-year-old man is on trial and publicly killed for doing that?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. And I'm just a very quick caveat here. I mean, all of this stuff is contested and people have different views about how things. So I'm just going to say what I think here, and I'm not going to give you the footnotes to the argument. But essentially, yes, in the era of the pre-Socratics that you were talking about, which is basically the 6th and the 5th centuries, so the bit leading into classical Athens, if you like, in that era, what you do seem to get is a sort of a kind of market for ideas, a competition for ideas, where people are getting prestige by coming up with ever more aggressively competitive, different conceptions of the way that the world works. There's an incentivization, if you like, to be combative towards established ideas. The people that are making all the running, because remember, this isn't a world with sort of newspapers or TV or YouTubers or anything like that. The only people who are coming up with new ideas basically are our friends, the philosophers, and this very broad, expansive kind of group of people. But people really like this stuff. They like the controversy generated by it. They like the idea that we're having new ways of seeing the world. And it matches the fact that the society is changing in this time. And they are, as I mentioned earlier, they're experiencing new cultures. They're going out and founding new colonies in other parts of the Mediterranean and the like. So it's a really mind-blowing time. So what the philosophers are doing in this period is sort of piggybacking on the transformative nature of society and the fact that everything is growing and expanding. The Greek world is getting richer and more, cities are getting bigger, people are living longer, economically, everything is prospering and the like. So philosophy is really a sort of a product of that energy around social transformations. In the 5th century, it seems that there was a sort of tipping point in around 430 BC when Anaxagoras was put on trial. And the reasons behind this are not entirely clear, but it seems to have been in part a political thing. Pericles is the dominant citizen in Athens at the time. He's great mates with Anaxagoras, your friend, and he's also got a number of other intellectuals in his circle. Now, his enemies, possibly including Cleon, who's another politician of the 420s or whatever, that's not absolutely clear, but they seem to have used the attack on Anaxagoras as a way of basically undermining the politician Pericles. What they seem to have done quite successfully is to have introduced a new law, which basically says that if you don't believe in or worship, again, it's that ambiguity, the gods of the state, then you can be basically executed for the equivalent of treason, for basically undermining the democracy. So it's about as nuclear an option as you can get. So Anaxagoras flees, goes into exile, never comes back to Athens. There's some evidence that other people might have been punished by the same law as well. We don't know about executions as such, but we know about people sort of getting into trouble and running away as a result of it. Again, this is all sort of contentious, and don't need to get into that. But it looks very much as if the same phrasing was used to attack Socrates in 399 BC. Now, is that because Socrates was a pain in the neck? Is it because he was, somebody who subverted all of the Athenians' cherished ideas about how things should be done? Is it because he was a questioner, somebody who was just restlessly, annoying? Basically, if anyone said something, Socrates would question it. This is all very possible, but there's also a possible political explanation, which people at the time raised, which was that this was just after Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans had installed a government which had sort of collapsed. And then there was this group called the 30 Tyrants, who oversaw a really awful, hated period in Athens's history, a short-lived period, but it was one of the most bloody times, and it was full of recrimination. Lots of people were executed, and it was remembered extremely badly. When the 30 Tyrants were overthrown, it was very quickly after that Socrates was tried and executed. And Socrates happened to have had very close links to many of the 30 Tyrants.
Oh, I didn't realize that last part. That's actually very interesting. Because for me, I don't know, I've always sort of looked at that as a really important historical moment of it just kind of being like conversation, and then the idea of seeing somebody put on trial for talking about these things. Then for me, at least, and again, I'm absolutely not an expert, I'm just a student that was reading all of this, and as a 20-year-old trying to compartmentalize it and then writing it down, it then seemed to me that then, after that, it made sense that it was, theater and myths came about, and that was how people discuss that stuff. Because as you mentioned, lots of theater and mediums like that, Greek tragedy, which obviously Aeschylus is the first of those, but lots of them then explored these ideas of atheism. So do you think that maybe that was a trigger for that, or do you think that was always sort of there, and then just Socrates just was a completely separate issue?
I think it was, yeah. So my reading of it, which is probably on the, if you like, the sort of I'm pushing the evidence as far as it can go, if you like. But my reading of it is that when you get this trial in 430 of Anaxagoras, this politically motivated trial, in a way, it really backfires. So what you get is, for the first time, atheism is defined in law. They don't use the word atheism. They use the word not believing in the gods, the phrase rather, not believing in the gods, but same difference. They basically say, if you are one of these people who doesn't believe in the gods, then we're going to throw the book at you. What this does is, in effect, creates two new categories. One is the category of atheism, and the other is, actually, interestingly, the category of religion. So for the first time, you've got, what is it to believe in the gods? What is it not to believe in the gods? What is it to be religious? What is it to be irreligious, to use, these terms loosely? And that is a really interesting moment. And I think that really changes the cultural landscape of Athens from the 430s onwards. And that's why you get this explosion of interest in these ideas in drama in particular. And tragedy and comedy are really the TV, the soap opera, the Netflix or whatever of the era. They don't have other forms of mass media or other ways of discussing these ideas. So when we can see this stuff bleeding into Greek tragedy, when we can see Sophocles' play Oedipus the King, which is centrally about somebody who says, no, I don't believe in those prophecies, it's a load of nonsense, they're just concocted by priests with their own interests in heart or whatever at heart. Of course, in Sophocles' play, it turns out that the prophecies are right. But he says, he and Jocasta both say versions of, stuff this, I'm just going to make my own way through the world as a human being. I'm not going to listen to what the gods allegedly tell me through their prophets or whatever. That is all, I think, energized by this moment when the Athenian legal system creates these categories of to put it very simply, religion and atheism.
So then your book does roll into Rome after that, and something that you do touch on in the book as well is that in Rome they would deify their emperors, which is a really foreign concept to us, I imagine, to a lot of people who are reading that, who are not in the classical world, that in Rome you'd have somebody walking around and then they drop dead and then all of a sudden now we're worshipping him like the gods. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that process of what that was like in Rome, sort of like where that started and all of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Japanese deify emperors, don't they? Even today. So, I mean, it's not entirely unfamiliar to the modern world. But as you say, the idea that a human could become a god is quite a difficult one to get your head around. It's not the Romans aren't the first to do that. In the post-classical period, in the period from 330 or so down to let's say 30 BC. The Greeks started doing it for a lot of their rulers as well, in their lifetime, interestingly, whereas the Romans worship emperors after they're dead. The Greeks do it in their own lifetime. And in fact, actually, the Greeks worship Roman emperors in their own lifetime as well. So they carry on that older practice. In a way, this is a development of an even older Greek idea, which is that there are certain people like Heracles who starts out as a human and achieves divinity as a result of his labors. So the Greeks had always thought, mythologically at least, that people could cross the boundary between the human and the divine. But what happens once living rulers start getting worshipped as emperors is that, again, Greek religion is a very flexible system, and people go around the houses to try and accommodate this. They say, oh, it's perfectly natural. We can explain it in this sort of ways, and it looks a little bit like this, looks a little bit like that. And the figure of Heracles is a very important figure there. So Alexander the Great can be linked to Heracles. You can say, why is it that we worship Alexander the Great? Well, it's because he did lots of labors, and and in the course of his great heroic achievements, he achieved a sort of godhead. And that's a bit like Heracles, and fine, we can work with that sort of system. But you also get people who turn that on its head and say, come on, mate, is that person I can see over there really a god? We all know that person's going to die. And then when that person dies, we're going to do some jiggery-pokery and sort of, pretend that they're a bit like a god. But actually that person is flesh and blood, just like you and me and the rest of them. So this idea of the deification of treating humans as gods is a innovation with ambiguous benefits, if you like. It's a very, very good way in terms of propaganda and power of saying worship this person, because you can depict them in the likeness of a god. You can put them in a temple with a god. You can say the gods are on their side, basically saying that Jupiter and Augustus, they're like that, is a really good propagandistic message. But the minute you start thinking about it, the minute you start thinking about what it actually means to say this human is actually not a human like you, but a god, then all sorts of doubts and uncertainties come in. And we have a number of ancient writers who really mischievously exploit those doubts and uncertainties.
So does that then change the definition of atheists then in the Roman world, because you have sort of a different definition of what a god can be potentially?
It can do, and there is one really interesting and really significant outcrop of what you're talking about there, which is that Jews and particularly Christians seem to be very reluctant to worship the Roman emperor for rather obvious reasons. And therefore, there's some evidence, and I'm not entirely convinced by this, but there's some evidence that Christians in particular were referred to as atheists because they refused to worship the emperor, the living emperor. I tend to think that's more Christians doing a sort of, flipping it around, Christians saying, you call us atheists when in fact you're the atheist or whatever. So I think it's probably more of a Christian discourse than a non-Christian discourse, but there's a bit of it coming from the non-Christian side. So yeah, I mean, that's really kind of interesting to play with, isn't it? The idea that Christians could be presented as atheists because they refused to worship the living emperor.
So to sort of try and wrap this conversation then for all of my viewers, do you think that a better place to explore the ideas of atheism is Greece as opposed to Rome, or do you think that there's a lot of also interesting stuff in Rome for people to dive into still and to explore?
Well, I think the story is different in Greece and in Rome. I mean, my book is, I suppose, it's probably a Greek-centered story. So what it's about is the origins of the ideas in Greece, and the way in which those stories changed when they hit the Roman Empire. Because what you have with the Roman Empire is just a huge geographical space. So whereas classical Athens is this quite compact space, relatively, I mean, it's a big city for the time, but a relatively face-to-face community where, people know who Socrates is, people know who Anaxagoras is and the like. And you see immediately how this idea travels over there and gets picked up by someone else or whatever. And you've got this great compact laboratory, if you like, for thinking about these new ideas of atheism. When you go into the Roman Empire, you're talking about millions of people over a huge geographical area. So you don't have that sense of, the connectivity of it. And you can't tell quite the same story of, in a 20-year window, we went from this to that. So you lose some of that focus. Nevertheless, what you do see is that because of the impact, I think, of these Greek ideas and the way in which they've evolved and the ways in which they've become embedded in the wider set of problems around things like emperor worship, you see in the Roman Empire even more diversity of approaches to religion in general. So you see someone like Pliny the encyclopedist, Pliny the Elder, who is essentially a sort of bluff old conservative, enormous gentleman. But he says, I don't really believe in all this sort of stuff. It's fine if people want to. It's a very, it's a world. The world of the Roman Empire is one in which there is no religious orthodoxy at all, other than obviously this very propagandistic belief and problematic belief in the divinity of the emperor, which works in different ways in the city of Rome and elsewhere. All that. It's that plurality of ways of approaching the divine that we see written on a huge canvas in the Roman Empire. And part of that story, which I only really touch on in the book, but is the origins of Christianity as another of these alternative ways of trying to resolve the structural problems with Greco-Roman ideas of the gods. And those structural problems are built around just the plurality of it, the fact that you've got so many gods in so many different places that need worshipping in all sorts of ways. So all of these people in the Roman Empire is just a huge laboratory for thinking about these ideas, and scaled up, so whether we're talking about an atheist like, sort of atheist like Pliny, or whether we're talking about someone like the Apostle Paul, all of them are in a sense trying to grapple with the same problems. How do we go from the mess of all this into something which is more coherent and resolved?
Thank you so much, Tim, though, for sitting down and chatting to me today.
It's a real pleasure.
But thank you again, and we'll be seeing everybody next time for more videos here on Monink, so we'll see you then.